I guess to start telling my story, I have to go back to my childhood. I think I was about 5 or 6 when my parents hustled up and brought a caravan to the south coast, near Weymouth. From then on, every school vacation we went there for the whole holiday. Of course, my dad couldn't go with us to the caravan every time because he had his own work commitments. So most of the year it was just my mom, my 2 sisters, and me in the caravan. After a couple of years, my dad bought a bigger caravan, and then we started having various friends and relatives over for a vacation away from the city. There were several other families from all over the country who also had caravans on the site. So when mom would take us to her place and we didn't have a dad with a car to go somewhere, my sisters and I would run around the lot and the neighborhood. We were lucky to have a family car in the 50s. Not many families had cars back then, and unfortunately, my mom never got to drive. Although she managed to scare the hell out of a couple of driving instructors before she gave up on the idea. There were always other kids on the playground for me to play with. My sisters always thought they were above playing with little boys. The person who became my best friend while I was there was Harry. Harry was a year older than me, but somehow the first time we met, we immediately hit it off. Harry had a huge red birthmark all over the left side of his face, and for some reason that I never could figure out when I was the same age, she was shunned by most of the other kids because of it. The birthmark, on the other hand, never bothered me, and Harry, being a real tomboy, turned into a good friend while I was there. In fact, unless Harry's family came to Weymouth for any school vacations, I found the place very boring. Harry was an only child, and we seemed more like brother and sister than just friends. My 2 older sisters were a pair of arrogant little cows when they were young. As life progressed and we got older, rock climbing and throwing rocks into the sea began to lose interest for Harry and me. Over the years, we explored just about every corner within a few miles. We found places to hide and watch young couples kissing each other. It was fun for 10-year-olds to try to figure out what they were doing. But as we got older and wiser, we started to feel awkward about sneaking up to watch them together. We never talked about anything, but we were such close friends that we seemed to feel what each of us was feeling inside. By then, Harry and I were considered old enough to take the bus to Weymouth on our own, where we explored the town and harbor. There were times when some ignorant people made remarks about Harry's face, and a couple of times I got into fights with other kids over it. I knew Harry got upset when they made remarks about her face. I guess when I was about 12 years old, Harry started wearing makeup to hide her birthmark. Honestly, I thought it looked worse than a bloody birthmark, but I never said anything. Harry and I started going to dances at a club on the caravan site. Oh, we'd been there many times over the years. There was children's entertainment in the morning then. As the day went on, there were dances for the children, in the afternoon for the little ones, then for those older ones in the early evening, and then for the adults. But Harry and I were dancing with the older kids now. The bouncers were old friends of Harry and me. If anyone said anything about Harry's birthmark, the bouncers were usually there before I could react. I think they were watching me, realizing that I wouldn't tolerate anyone upsetting Harry. On Easter of my 15th year, Harry disappeared. My whole family arrived in Weymouth on the Thursday before Good Friday. I went straight to Harry's caravan, but found that it was still closed for the winter. Investigation at the site office informed me that the caravan had been sold. The rest of the vacation was the worst vacation of my life. My mom and dad picked me up every day. Later, my dad would tell me that he was trying to find out what had happened to Harry and her family. Years later, he told me that Harry's father died of the flu during the winter. Her mother couldn't afford to keep the caravan going and sold it. My father had hoped that he might be able to get Harry's address so that I could at least write to her. But he never did. Harry and I had been friends in Weymouth, but somehow it never occurred to us to find out each other's addresses and write. I only knew that she lived somewhere near Bath. After Harry was gone, Weymouth lost interest to me. That summer, I stayed at home with my father when my mother and sisters went to Weymouth. Dad and I went there during his summer vacation. The rest of the summer, I hung out with my high school friends. The next year, my mom decided it was time for us to join the latest boom, going abroad for summer vacation. I think my sisters, who by then were dating boyfriends, started pressuring her about spending so much of the year away from their current favorites. The caravan was sold, and the clan went off to bask in the sun for a couple weeks. A small clarification: not by airplane, but by train. The journey took 24 hours. I joined the family on their first trips to Rimini in Italy. But by the time I was 18, I wanted to get away with my buddies, so I stopped traveling with them. By then, pop festivals had become fashionable, and me and the guys would go there whenever the opportunity presented itself. It was the 60s, and we had a great time for a few years. When I graduated from college, I tried a lot of professions without being able to get a job in any of them. By then, I was the proud owner of a 1959 Hillman Minx, my personal station wagon. One day when my employer said something I didn't like, hell knows what it was, I told him to shove his job, which I couldn't stand anyway, up his ass and walked away. I hadn't gotten far when, stopped at a stoplight, I felt a hard jolt. Someone had slammed into the back of the Hillman. I got out and the truck driver appeared in front of me and was very apologetic. I don't remember how the conversation went, but it ended with me following him to his yard, which was nearby, where his boss promised to foot the bill for a new rear bumper and install it. The next day, I took the car to a transportation shop to have the new bumper installed and sat and waited in the waiting room while they did it. Stranger things happen in life. When some guy poked his head through the door and said, "Come with me," I followed him like a lamb. Why I never asked him why he wanted me to climb into the driver's seat of the truck, I never could figure out. I sat there like a dummy while he pointed out all the controls and explained the gearbox. Then, when he told me to drive straight out of the gate and turn left, I just started the engine and did what he told me. I drove the truck for about 30 minutes before we were back in the yard. When I parked the truck, he told me, "You can do it. If you asked me, I'd say you're a born craftsman." He then got out of the truck and started walking toward the office. I followed him, and as we walked through the door, the boss I had met the day before came out of an inner office and said to the guy, "Mitch, I thought I asked you to take this guy for his driving test?" "Asked you to. He'll do great." "How did you do that if he's still sitting in my goddamn office?" "Well, I was unemployed, so I ended up getting the job and the other guy didn't." The following Monday, I hit the road as a truck driver. I have to say, I loved it. The first few months, I had no idea what I was doing, but I found that I had a great sense of direction. In those days, drivers took care of each other, and I have to thank many of them for teaching me how to load trucks properly and how to lower them on ropes and sheets. Working on the road seemed to suit my temperament. It was the first job I really enjoyed and got the hang of. I soon discovered that there were several companies that asked my boss to send me when they hired a truck. I realized that he liked it because it proved that I was doing a good job and keeping my customers happy. At Marshall's, one of the companies I regularly picked up loads from, there was a girl named Thelma working in the dispatch room. Thelma was a doll in every sense of the word. She dressed up to tease the guys and enjoyed taking them on as they ran around her. Short skirts and tight blouses showed off her gorgeous figure, and the high-heeled shoes showed off her legs to perfection. I realized Thelma was a tease when I first came to see Marshall. I'm certainly no slouch with women, but I'm not the kind of damn fool who sticks out his tongue at the sight of pretty legs. I let those dumbasses chase Thelma around and conducted strictly business negotiations with her. And that was the case every time I called there, since she looked after the control room. As time went on, I found myself going to Marshall's more and more often, until I found myself working almost exclusively for them, along with a couple of our other drivers. I have to admit, I enjoyed working for them. It was like one big happy family. That's more than can be said for most companies. While waiting for a load, we had complete freedom of action and access to the dining room at will. Old Man Marshall prided himself on knowing by name each of the 200-plus men in his workforce. Pretty soon he recognized my name and the names of two other drivers from our firm who worked for him regularly. It was early December, and one Friday evening I pulled into our yard to fill up the diesel tank and get my paycheck. As I walked into the office, Mr. Wilkins, my boss, came out of there and asked, "So kid, what are your plans for tomorrow?" Nothing he hadn't asked me before. It was usually a precursor to him asking me to work as a driver on Saturday. Nothing in particular. What do you have for today, boss? I replied. Have you got a decent suit, lad? We're going to Marshall's for Christmas. He invites us every year, and if we don't all come, the old bastard gets upset. I don't mind, boss. I can comb my hair pretty good when I need to, you know that. Good. I'll meet you here at the shipyard at 6:30. George and Jack will ride together, but I'll have plenty of room in the car for you. You can ride with me and the wife. I was a little curious as to why George and Jack weren't going to ride with the boss and his wife, since his damn big Jaguar easily accommodated 5 people. But I didn't say anything. The next day afternoon, I felt like I was dressed up like a turkey. I hadn't had an excuse to wear any of my suits since I'd been on the road. I climbed into my boss's car to drive to Marshall's factory, where business was to be conducted in the huge dining room. Mr. Wilson had insisted that I call him Bill for the evening, but I knew that on Monday I would call him Boss again. He introduced me to his lovely wife, and I wondered how the old git had managed to get such a babe. I decided that the answer probably lies in money, but we'll forget about that since it's irrelevant to my story. As soon as we arrived at Marshall's, we were joined by George and Jack and their wives, and I realized why they hadn't come with us. I wondered why they hadn't told me I could bring a guest with me. Not that I had anyone in particular in mind. But if they were inviting wives, they must have invited girlfriends too. I figured it was an oversight on Bill Wilkins's part. Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins sat at the top table with Old Man Marshall, his wife, all the directors, and I assumed the bosses of the other firms contracting with him. The 5 of us wandered around the tables looking for our assigned seats. With some confusion, we found a seat with the names of Jack, George, and their wives, but we didn't find our own nearby. I wandered around for a while longer and was beginning to suspect that I had been forgotten. To be honest, if I didn't find my place, I intended to slip out and hide until the meal was over. But suddenly, Thelma patted me on the shoulder and led me to my seat, which was right next to hers. Come on, I'm not as stupid as I seem. Thelma sat in the seat where my chaperone would have sat if I had been allowed to bring him along, which of course meant that I was sitting where her chaperone should have been sitting, and I got the feeling that I was being set up. Old Man Marshall was making his rounds while we waited for everyone to get sorted out and seated. When he came up to me, thanking me for coming and all the good work I had done on his behalf, he said, "Well, my boy, our lovely Thelma had no escort for this evening. I hope you won't mind looking after her for me." I assured him that I would look after her, but I couldn't help wondering why sweet Thelma couldn't find a date. Dinner that night was prepared by outside vendors, as all of the dining hall staff had been invited. Some of them sat at our table, and I watched them scrutinize everything the vendors made and served. I doubt if a single dish has ever been subjected to such scrutiny. Endless speeches followed the meal. Tables were moved to the side and a band played. The music was strictly middle-aged, aimed at the entire staff, whose ages ranged from 16 to 60. Thelma and I danced alone, but a few guys came up and asked her to dance too. By about 10:30, I had drunk perhaps a little more free booze than I should have. Dancing with Thelma to a slow number, I asked her why she had never been able to find a date for the evening. Thelma giggled. I think she'd had more drinks than she should have, too. Don't be silly. I could have found plenty of guys who would have loved to come, but I wanted to spend this evening with you. Why? Do you really want to know? I wouldn't ask if I didn't want to. Well, because you intrigue me. Oh, I intrigue you, do I? And why is that? Well, you know, you're different. I must have thrown Thelma a questioning look. Come on, you know what I mean. You don't chase me around like other guys do. I'm wondering why. Do you not find me attractive, or do you like men or something? Thelma, no, I'm certainly not a bloody poof. And I find you a very attractive young woman. Oh, so you have a steady girlfriend? No, as a matter of fact, not at the moment. Then why haven't you ever suggested that I go out with you? I've never said anything to offend you, have I? Quite the opposite, Thelma. You're a nice girl, as I said. But how old are you? 18 to 19. 19, replied Thelma. I'm 24, and I'm on the road 5 days a week and quite often away for several nights at a time. I'm looking for a permanent relationship. Please don't take this personally or as a criticism of you. I'm looking for a girl who I can go back to on Friday nights and who is willing to put up with me doing very little other than going down to the pub for a drink. A girl who won't go out with other guys when I'm away for a couple of nights. If you were looking for an unusual date with me, you got it this evening. But I don't think you want to settle down just yet. You like it too much when guys chase you around. Oh, is that so? Yes, I'm afraid it is. You're not disappointed, are you? Maybe a little disappointed. But can I at least give you some mistletoe tonight? Sure, girl, I'd love to. After that, I got the feeling that Thelma was trying to prove something. Anyway, every time we danced, we ended up under that damn mistletoe. About 1 o'clock in the morning, George came in and said Mr. Wilkins was ready to leave. I kissed Thelma goodnight, and she walked with me to the car. As the car was pulling out of the parking lot, I looked back and saw another guy walk up to her and put his arm around her shoulders. The next week I had another contract, so I didn't go to Marshall's. The week after that, they closed for the Christmas holidays. The boss talked me into doing a special job the day after Boxing Day. As a result, I got to spend the New Year's break in Aberdeen. At the time, they had just started looking for oil in the North Sea, and I was to take some research equipment there that was supposedly urgently needed. The weather was terrible, and I sat in port for almost 2 weeks waiting for a blood ship to come in so I could unload the equipment. I had a great time in the pubs, though. There's no better place in the world to spend New Year's Eve than Scotland. Even if it's blowing a gale, pouring rain, and bloody cold. By the time the ship I was waiting for finally showed up, the novelty had already started to wear off. Apparently, it was hiding from the storm in a harbor further up the coast. No one had realized to send me a message to meet them there. Yeah, well, I was just a lowly truck driver who cared about me. Back down south, I took a couple days off so I wouldn't have to go on New Year's Eve. I can't say my boss liked the idea, but he knew my reputation as someone who could tell my bosses what to do with their work if I was upset. And there was plenty of work for drivers in those days if you knew what you were doing. At Wednesday morning, I parked first thing in the Marshall's loading dock. Upon entering the control room, I got the shock of my life. Sitting in Thelma's chair was a woman I hardly recognized, wearing a baggy sweater, slacks, and with her hair tied back in a ponytail. When she saw me, she jumped up from her chair and came running toward me. Before I could say anything, her arms wrapped around my neck and her tongue tried to find my tonsils. Jesus, girl, are you trying to strangle me? I asked when she finally came up for air. I've missed you. Now tell me, will I pass the test now? Look, Thelma, I don't know what to say. Tell me, do I still look like a little slut who wants to run around with different guys every night? I never said you did. Maybe you didn't, but you implied it. Now tell me, do I qualify as your girlfriend now? Well, of course you are. You always have, but... Good. Then I'll be waiting for you to pick me up Friday night. Here's my address, and here's your invoices for the rest of the week. Oh, I've got it all worked out so you can finish early Friday. Now you better get on it because you've got a lot to do today and tomorrow. Okay, what the hell could I do or say that wouldn't upset the girl? So like a lamb to the slaughter, I kissed her and went back to the loading dock to load my truck. Friday night, I pulled up to her house to pick her up, around 7 o'clock. She came out of the house with an overnight bag. What's that bag for Thelma? I asked nervously. Well, I thought you wanted to go to the local pub. It must be 35 miles away at least. I thought I could stay at your place if you wanted me to. It would save you having to drive back and forth picking me up and dropping me off all weekend. So Thelma stayed the weekend at my parents' house. No, not in my bed, but in my sister's bed. By then, they had both married and moved away. Thelma slept in their old room. The following weekend, I stayed at her parents' house, and we visited pubs around where she lived. Her parents were very nice. I got on well with her father and younger brother. I'm not sure her mother was all that interested in the beginning, but she eventually got over it. Yes, you heard right. Thelma has had me wrapped around her finger since that very first weekend. Since then, she had never worn anything provocative to work or any other time that I knew of, except when she was dating me. And then I was shocked if she wasn't dressed to the tune of $1 million. 3 months later, we got engaged, and before I knew it, we had already put a deposit down on an old, shabby house almost halfway between our parents' two houses. For the next year, we spent all of our free time practically rebuilding the house. At least we brought it up to 20th century standards. When the house was finished, the next logical step was to get married. And so we did. The reception, of course, was held in the Marshall's dining room, and the catering was handled by the dining room staff. Old man Marshall was there, came over and told me how happy he was to see us together. How much he was involved in Thelma's plan to capture me, I never realized. Perhaps Thelma was just using him, as I was to learn, she used a lot of people. Life over the next few years was sweet. Thelma got pregnant pretty soon after we were married. Well, we used condoms most of the time, but we were just married and things got a little hectic sometimes. You know how it is. We had one child, Tracy, and we decided to have a second, Helen, as soon as possible. 2, we decided, would be enough, and Thelma found a permanent solution to the birth control problem. When she was carrying Helen, she developed problems and the doctors were very concerned. She was admitted to the hospital early and monitored closely. When Thelma was still carrying Tracy, I got a call one day from Old Man Marshall. The gist of the call was that his transportation manager was retiring. Since Thelma was on maternity leave, he was, to put it bluntly, on shit street. He had already talked to Bill Wilkins and asked me if I would take over as transportation manager, at least until Thelma went back to work. This would be convenient for me, as I would be on hand when Thelma gave birth and would not be racing across the country while Thelma breastfed the baby. So it was with some reluctance that I agreed. The only problem was that when Thelma and I decided to have a second child, my position at Marshall's became permanent. The job wasn't difficult. It required knowledge of vehicles and the ability to plan the routes the trucks should take. After a while, I found that I really enjoyed it. Not as much as being on the road, but the money was better and I didn't have to work overtime. In a way, I was glad to be able to spend time with our 2 little angels. I was sure that when they grew up, they would become cannibals like their mother. I must admit that there were troubling times ahead of me, but I figured I would cross that bridge when I got to it. So, life went on, as I suppose it does for most couples with young children. I honestly thought I had everything worked out in my life. A good job, a nice house, a loving wife, and a wonderful pair of daughters. But things can go awry exactly when you don't expect them to. If I wanted to pinpoint a time, I'd say my earliest indication that something wasn't as it should be was when Tracy had just turned 6. I was driving to work one morning and noticed a car behind me. Okay, you say we have public roads, so you should expect a car to follow you occasionally. But you notice that I said, the car behind me. Remember, I worked as a truck driver for several years. If you drive a truck all day long and you're good at your job, you're very attentive to what's going on around you. If you're hauling valuable cargo, there may be several small movers in the truck behind you who want to save you the work of delivering it. Or it could be one of the other big headaches for a driver with a tight schedule, an unmarked police patrol car. If you know what you're doing, keep an eye out for cars coming up behind you. All drivers should do this anyway. I'm talking about the car and its passengers. Oh, you can spot them from a mile away if you have your head on straight, believe me. No, the car I noticed behind me was standing still. As we pulled out into the intersection, if he stayed behind, he'd overtake anything and everything until he was on my tail again. He definitely wasn't a cop. They drive a lot better than this Pratt guy, but it was obvious he was following me. In the evening, as I was leaving work, another car tailgated me. This time, another car with a woman behind the wheel, but she didn't leave my side until I got home. The next morning, the guy was there again, and in the evening, the woman followed me to the pub. Thursday night, I have a drink, just one since I'm driving, and play snooker with some of my staff. We hadn't been in the pub long when I noticed her walk in, followed shortly by a guy. They went to the bar separately and got their drinks. What happened next was what I might call a farcical scenario. I'm playing snooker with one of the guys, and this slut is sitting behind the bar, showing off every anatomical feature she can, and staring at me so intently that I can feel her eyes drilling holes in my back. A couple times during my play, the woman's eyes met mine, and when they did, she smiled at me. The only thing I couldn't figure out was who was trying to set me up and why, but I didn't have the slightest chance to bite. I don't know what kind of idiot they thought I was, but I wasn't going to play the game they were up to. The question of why, I thought I had an answer. Old Man Marshall was very much a family man and placed a lot of importance on family. Christ, he ran his company like it was one big family. I, on the other hand, was an outsider who was invited into the firm after I married one of Marshall's favorite employees. I quickly became his favorite, and rumors spread throughout the firm that I held a prominent position at Marshall. I figured someone was jealous or thought that I would eventually become his competition for promotion. Whoever it was, I figured he was trying to tempt me into something that would ultimately ruin my marriage and likely change old Marshall's opinion of me. Finishing my drink, I bought another to hide my true intentions. Then, after taking a sip, I headed toward the gentleman, where I slipped out the back door without anyone noticing. I would have loved to get even with these two, but having no idea who was trying to set me up, I didn't know who I could trust. So I just drove home. I wondered how long they had been waiting for me to return from the gentleman's. The next morning, the guy was there again, but this time I missed him easily. In the evening, as I drove out of the marshal's yard, a woman immediately followed me. I took her on a little mystery tour that ended at a small factory estate that I knew well from driving trucks. It ended in a cul-de-sac. Parking the car, I crept between buildings where the woman couldn't see me and snuck around until I was behind her car. Then she suddenly found me standing at the door of her car. She immediately realized that I was following her and, taking me by surprise, drove the car backwards at high speed. She made a skid turn that would have put Rockford to shame, and within moments, she was gone. Cursing myself for letting her get away, I got back in the car and drove home. To be honest, for a while I thought that was the end of the episode. They never followed me again. I figured that since I had spotted them, they had given up. But 2 weeks later, when I arrived at the pub on a Thursday night, there was a different woman sitting behind the bar. As I was buying my drink from the bartender, she made some sort of remark. To be honest, I didn't connect her with the other two at first. It wasn't until she joined me at the jukebox where I was selecting a couple tunes that it got to me. "Back off, lady, and tell your friends I'm not as dumb as I look," I told her. "And tell that Pratt guy with the Granada that if I ever see him again, I'm going to punch his goddamn head in." The woman was taken by surprise. She looked completely shocked and left the pub almost immediately. I noticed the Ford Granada in the parking lot when I arrived, but not its driver. I suppose it was about a month after that when Thelma stumbled one day in those damn high-heeled shoes she'd started wearing again and broke a bone in her ankle. While she was in the hospital, I got a call asking me to come and get the girls. When I arrived, the doctor told me that the fracture, though not serious, needed to be fixed with a cast. But there was a problem. Thelma's ankle was swollen, and we had to wait for the swelling to go down before we could put a cast on it. Thelma would have to stay in the hospital until the cast was put on. Consequently, I had to take a couple of days off to look after the girls, as it was during the school summer vacation. It was a nice change for me to play mom and dad. I know they took great pleasure in pulling a Mickey out of me when it came to cooking. I'm not a very good cook. I had a hard time guessing the timing. How the heck do you get all the different elements to finish cooking at the same time? Anyway, as I was juggling things in the kitchen that evening, the phone rang. Since I had my hands full, I asked Tracy to take the call. At 6 years old, I thought she could handle it. We had taught her what to do and say. "Oh, I'm sorry, Uncle Frank. Mom's in the hospital. She hurt her leg. No daddy to watch us. Bye-bye." Tracy then hung up the phone. "Who was that, Tracy?" I asked. "Oh, just Uncle Frank," she replied. There was only one problem with that answer, as far as I was concerned. Who the hell was Uncle Frank? I'd never heard of him before. I was just about to inquire further when I heard Helen calling for her sister from the other room, and Tracy ran to see what she needed. Curious, I followed Tracy, but for some reason I didn't enter the playroom. You're going to get in trouble from Mom. You broke your promise to Mom that you would never tell Dad about Uncle Frank. What the hell did I just hear from my daughter? I thought, and then I heard Tracy's response. A typical child's response. I didn't tell Daddy about Uncle Frank. This was followed by the usual, you did, and I didn't. I decided not to get into an argument. Both girls obviously realized that I wasn't supposed to know about this Uncle Frank thing, and interfering in this conversation dispute would mean they were both on guard. I decided it was best to leave it at that and wait until they were calm about it again. But I was certainly concerned. I couldn't understand why Thelma would want to hide some guy from me. Unless... Now that was a question I didn't want to ask myself. Denial, I guess, wouldn't let me think that. The swelling on Thelma's ankle hadn't gone down overnight like the doctor had hoped. It seemed to me that it was much more swollen than the day before. When the nurse told me it could take as long as a week for the swelling to go down, I thought I had better get some help at home before the girls came down with food poisoning or started showing signs of malnutrition by refusing to eat my food. My sister volunteered to stay and help with the girls, which allowed me to take some time to do some office work as well. Sarah took her 9-year-old daughter Marcy with her. I can't say I liked Marcy very much. I think she took after her mother, who, although she was my sister, was never one of my favorite people when we were young. Now that we are older, our relationship is much better. I don't know exactly why I did it. Maybe I needed to confide in someone, but I told Sarah about it to Uncle Frank. My girls may have been sworn to keep the secret from me, but Thelma might not have stipulated to other people. When I told Sarah, she sat thinking for a while. Then she asked, "Do you think Thelma?" "I don't know what to think, Sarah, but I don't like it when my family keeps secrets from me." "Sarah, is that why you hated me and Ginny when we were little? We never told you about anything." "Maybe, but I certainly won't tolerate my wife keeping secrets from me, especially when it comes to men. I don't blame you, Thelma is a beautiful woman. I could never understand how you captivated her." "The thing is, Sarah, it wasn't me who captured Thelma. It was she who chased me." "Well, she had good taste. You've got to hand it to her. Anyway, what do you want? Do you want me to ask the girls about this Frank?" "I thought they might open up to you. I definitely heard Helen say that their mother made them promise not to talk about him. Now they might think they wouldn't violate her trust if they told you." "Leave it to me, and I'll try to find out something." "Thanks, sis, but try not to make a fuss and keep them on guard." The next morning, I left Sarah with the kids and headed to work. After lunch, I visited Thelma at the hospital, and she told me that Sarah had been with the girls for about an hour earlier in the day. I don't know what made me do it, but I asked Thelma if there was anything she wanted to tell me. I think I confused her. At least she didn't realize what I was asking her, because all she came up with was a list of unpaid bills and chores that needed to be done around the house. That night, after Sarah put the kids to bed, she sat me down at the kitchen table and gave me a stern look. "Well, I don't know who this Frank guy is, but I think you need to find out what the hell is going on." "Then you asked the girls about him. What did they say?" "Don't be silly. I put Marcel in front of the problem. I figured the girls wouldn't recognize her as an adult and... oh, well, you know how kids think. Anyway, about this man, Frank. Apparently Thelma and him were talking to each other outside the school while Thelma waited for the girls to come out. From what the girls understand, he's divorced and his kids have to go to their school. They say this is the only opportunity they have to see them since he doesn't live with his wife. As far as I can tell, she had to get custody, and he claims she is preventing him from seeing them, so he has to watch them on the school grounds. But why hide it from me? Marcy isn't stupid. She wondered the same thing. According to the girls, this Frank's wife supposedly works at your firm, and rumor has it you can tell her he's watching the kids at school. Oh, I see. Well, I suppose that explains it. But surely Thelma doesn't think I'd grass a guy up in front of his wife. Bullshit. That silly story has no basis in fact. Think about it for yourself. If this Frank guy was at the school when the kids came out of there, why wouldn't his so-called ex-wife see him there? And when I sent Marcy back with a few more questions, I got truly worried. None of your girls have any idea who this guy Frank's kids are. Come on, it's a small school. It doesn't make any sense. On top of that, when Thelma takes the girls to the playground at the park after school, Frank is there too. More importantly, he's been to the park during school vacations and has been to the mall with Thelma and the girls more than once. He buys the kids ice cream, candy, and hamburgers. Little brother, you have a serious problem, and you need to deal with it as soon as possible. Perhaps Thelma had planned to meet this Frank the other day when she had her fall. That's probably why he called here that day and asked why she never showed up. So you think they're having an affair? How the hell should I know what to think? But I will tell you that something very suspicious is going on, and we need to find out what it is. I'm glad you said we, because I was starting to lose the thread of the conversation. Well, don't go off the top of your head. There may be an innocent explanation for this that we can't see yet. But frankly, I doubt it. Now think about it, brother. Can you think of anything Thelma has said or done in the last few months that might have made a difference? Anything unusual or different than usual? Well, not that Thelma did anything, but a strange thing happened that week. I told Sarah about being followed and about two girls who I can only describe as trying to pick me up at the pub. Sarah couldn't understand what it was about either. The next day went much the same as the previous day. Thelma's ankle started to show signs that the swelling was going down, and the nurses told me that everything was going well and she should be home by the weekend. That evening, when the kids went back to bed, Sarah, who had been on edge since I'd been in the house, couldn't wait to be alone. "What color was the car that followed you?" she asked as soon as the kitchen door closed. "It was a maroon Ford Granada." "Why?" "Almost. The girls called it dark red. I think that's the one Frank was following you. And I've got some bad news. Marcy says she thinks the girls had it in for him. They described his insides to her in detail. They said how big it was, how soft the seats were. And another thing, the kids' locks were on, so they couldn't open the doors from the inside. Kids will only notice things like that if they've been inside the car." That's where I agree with you. Look, I did a favor today and called Bill Wilkins. He's got friends on the police force and he's trying to get names and addresses from the license plates of those cars that followed me. Good idea, brother. I think you owe Marcy a big debt for all the things she did to the girls. Yeah, I know. I'm lucky she's as cunning as her mother. I don't know if I should take that as a compliment or not, replied Sarah with a smile on her face. Next chapter. Friday morning, Bill Wilkins called me into the office fairly early. He told me that the Granada belonged to one Frank Williams, who was well known to the police. The other two cars were rented from a cheap car rental company. Strangely, one of them was not returned, and the renter, a man, used fake IDs to take both cars. After lunch, after making a few phone calls, I went to the hospital to pick up Thelma. I talked a little with the nurse I had been in contact with all week before Thelma knew I was coming. After a little chat, she told me that every day after I left, a man came to see Thelma. Something seemed strange to her because he never brought anything with him for Thelma. Most people bring something with them, even if it's just a get-well card. No, I thought. Our Frank Williams won't want to leave any evidence that might pique my curiosity. Frank Williams is nice enough when he's out hunting. But if he thought he could get away with what I suspected he was up to, he had another thing coming. That evening, when we got home, Thelma was surprised that the kids didn't meet us at the door. Walking into the house on crutches, she asked where they were. I sent them to their folks for a few days, thought it would give you a chance to get cleaned up. Oh, that wasn't necessary, said Thelma, getting comfortable on the living room couch. I'd rather they were here. But I think they were, Thelma. We have a lot to sort out in the next couple days. I don't want the girls to get upset unnecessarily. What things? Asked Thelma, as Sarah entered the room carrying a tray with tea and coffee on it. Oh, Sarah, you're still here. You didn't have to stay. I'm sure I can take care of myself and the children. I can stand on my ankle. It's in a cast now. I'm not here for you, Thelma. I'm here for my brother. Sarah said this with real venom in her voice. Thelma's face suddenly lost all its color, and she looked at me. What does all this mean? Well, that's the question I was going to ask you, Thelma. What the hell is going on between you and that perverted asshole Frank Williams? Thelma shifted her gaze from me to Sarah, and then back to me. It seemed to me that for a moment she was at a loss for words. Then she apparently made up her mind. Well, I suppose you've learned everything, haven't you? I suppose you had to at some point. I'm sorry, but I've fallen in love with someone else. I didn't want to tell you, but I'm going to divorce you and then marry Frank. Just like that? I asked. Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for weeks now. I didn't want to hurt you any more than I had to. Sarah was about to say something, but the sound of movement behind her stopped her. That's all I needed to hear. I can start taking action now. I'll be in touch. A woman's voice came from the hallway. Then we heard the front door close. I smiled at Sarah and then turned to Thelma again. That sounds very thoughtful of you if it isn't a lie. You put Frankie up to trying to set me up, didn't you? What was the plan? I get seduced by one of his prostitute girlfriends and, hey, presto, you divorce me? I guess you thought I'd have to pay you alimony then, didn't you? What a sweet wife I had. Well, tough luck, baby. I didn't fall into your little trap. I gotta hand it to you, it was a good idea. You wanted to leave me with my good job and live with an unemployed asshole, and you planned on me supporting you in your new life. I don't know what you're talking about. What's the setup? Well, if you don't know, you better ask your weirdo boyfriend. Here's how it's going to go down. You have the weekend to get all your shit out of my house. My lawyer is already preparing the divorce papers. He says they'll be ready for you to sign by Monday. You can't do that. You're the one who has to leave the house. I'm going to need it for the kids. Oh no, you don't, honey. You and your weirdo boyfriend won't come within 100 yards of my kids. I'll let you visit them as long as either a social worker or me is present. Oh yes, it is social services that is going to get that warrant from the judge tonight. What are you talking about? They can't do that. Oh, but they can, honey. You know, I always thought social workers were a pain in the damn ass. But once they found out it was Frank Williams you were planning to cohabitate with and expose our kids to, they got very sympathetic. They won't let you near them again, and I think the police will want to talk to you too. I don't understand. Why would the police want to talk to me? You stupid bitch, intervened Sarah. She was determined to speak up. So I let her continue. What do you think Williams was doing hanging around that damn school? The man is a goddamn pedophile with a track record a mile long. He wasn't after you, you stupid little cow. He wanted your daughters. Thelma's face was pleasant to look at. She shifted her gaze from one to the other of us again. You're lying. Frank wouldn't have done that. Oh no? Where do you think he's spent the last 7 years? He's been working overseas in the Far East, I think. More like the bloody Isle of Wight. That's where Parkhurst Prison is. It's a stretch to call it overseas. Anyway, when the police are done talking to him and my kids, we'll find out if he's done anything to them. But I'm warning you, if that bastard touches my kids, I'll probably kill you both. Sarah had to call an ambulance because Thelma suddenly passed out, and we couldn't wake her up. Her father or brother must have picked her up from the hospital because I sure as hell didn't. I never saw her again until the day we signed the divorce papers. Thelma realized there was no point in asking for custody of the children because social services still had an order that she had put the girls in jeopardy. It turned out that Thelma had left the children in William's care more than once while she went to the hair salon and the like. But the professionals who interviewed my girls told me they were sure nothing had happened. In their opinion, Williams was still in what they called the grooming stage and was anxious not to scare them off by acting too quickly. Williams had committed no crime that the police could pin down. They were sure he had stolen a hired car, but hadn't used it for its intended purpose when the bubble burst. When I asked out of curiosity why they thought Williams had stolen the car, The police inspector looked at me and said, "Well, perhaps, sir, you are lucky, even if you think you have fallen on hard times." The last unfortunate woman Williams persuaded to get into bed with him so he could abuse her children was a widow. Her husband was killed in an unsolved traffic accident. The problem is, we can't prove what Williams intended to use the car for, but we can speculate. From now on, if he stays here, we'll be watching him very closely. Not too closely, I hope, I replied. The officer looked around to make sure no one else was within earshot. Oh, I shouldn't worry too much about that, sir, provided no one is killed. You'd be surprised how long the officers keeping watch will stay out. Of course, I never told you that, and make sure you have a damn good and reliable alibi. There are plenty of do-gooders out there who think Williams and people like him are just mentally ill and in need of sympathy. Seems to me that if he was hanged, drawn, and quartered, he'd get off easy. He's a cunning, evil bastard. And, sir, don't be too hard on your wife. Williams is an expert at manipulating people. If you saw him in that interrogation room, you wouldn't believe the butter melting in his mouth. She never stood a chance from the moment he targeted her. You know, it wasn't until we let her read Williams' file that she really believed what a pervert he was. In retrospect, I'm lucky to be alive. Williams, of course, had insurance for all eventualities. But knowing what the asshole planned to do to my family, I decided I wasn't going to turn the other cheek. But I could afford to wait for the dust to settle. For the next few years, things were on hold. Thelma wasn't allowed to visit the kids alone. This was frustrating for both the girls and their mother, as she couldn't take them anywhere. From what the police told me, and from what Thelma herself heard, I don't think she had a chance when she confronted Williams. I know she would never have tolerated his abuse of our girls if she had known about it. I have to think that way to be sane. So after a year or so, I asked social services to relax Thelma's visitation with the kids, and they agreed. Since the children were never taken into custody, I had the final say in the matter. Thelma told me several times that she wished we could be together again, but I told her that would never happen. I knew from talking to neighbors that on some days, while the kids were at school, Williams' car was parked outside. Nothing could convince me that Thelma and Frank Williams were having a Bible reading session. Well, I don't know. There's a lot in the Bible. I told Thelma she should find herself another mug, which she eventually did. He turned out to be a pretty nice guy, albeit a little cocky. From what I understand, he asked Thelma to marry him, but she refused until she told him everything. As far as I could tell, he listened to her story, and then, without saying a word to her, got up and walked out. 2 weeks later, Thelma hit Williams with a car outside a local store. She spotted Williams outside another school nearby. Thelma called the police, and they took him in for questioning. But Thelma waited outside the police station until he was released. She then drove her car into him as he was walking on the sidewalk. She then drove to the river and threw herself into it, presumably trying to drown herself. I have to say, I'm not at all sure that was the case. Thelma is a very good manipulator, and from what I heard, a police car followed her. She was initially charged with manslaughter. The charges were later dropped. Thelma's mental state was deemed so unstable that she could not plead guilty. She was placed under the care of a local psychiatric hospital, but it was soon concluded that she was not a danger to the community, and she was discharged after a month or so. She had to see a psychiatrist every couple of weeks, but that was it. And of course, social services tightened up to make sure she visited the children again. That's just the way it worked out. Sarah's husband Ralph started working on the oil rigs in the North Sea. So Sarah and her family actually moved in with me to help look after the girls and also to organize Thelma's visits to them. By then, though, more and more time had passed between each visit, and I hadn't spoken to her for what seemed like years. Next chapter. I think it was just before Helen's 10th birthday. One evening, Sarah, Ralph, and I were sitting in the kitchen talking about the old days when we were kids. Of course, the conversation turned to Sarah and me on our summer vacations in Weymouth. Ralph floated the idea of us all going there for 2 weeks that summer. Sarah jumped at the idea, and before Ralph and I realized what she was doing, She had invited Ginny and her family to come too. We rented 3 caravans next to each other on the same property where our family had vacationed as kids. The kids loved the beach and enjoyed talking about the places we played as kids. We found a few locals we knew as kids. And one morning I took my 2 girls for a walk along the cliffs. Everything here has changed a lot due to the erosion of the mud slopes by the sea. It took me quite a while to find the tree on which Harry and I carved our initials each year. Some of them could still be made out quite clearly. H&H 1959. Tracy said, I wonder who they were and where they are now. Well, one of them is standing right next to you, I replied. You're kidding, Daddy, said Tracy. Then who was H? Oh, she was just a friend. What do you mean? Was she your childhood sweetheart, Daddy? Asked Helen excitedly. I wasn't prepared for what I had gotten myself into. I guess she was, in a way. I spent many long, happy vacations with her when I was your age, but I'm not sure she could be called my sweetheart. I only kissed her once. Was it nice? I wasn't sure if Tracy was trying to embarrass me or if she was really interested. Yes, it was very pleasurable. I would have loved to kiss her more, but she didn't come back the next year. Oh, that's sad. Were you very upset? Yes, I was, but if you don't mind, we'll change the subject. The subject was changed, but for the rest of the vacation, everywhere we went, my 2 girls asked if I had been there with Harry. Sarah and Ginny would think quickly and answer Tracy before I had a chance to shut up and say I didn't remember. Marks were appearing on the cakes, and things that Sarah and Ginny were making that looked remarkably like H&H. I tried to show my displeasure, but they would start laughing, and I couldn't keep from laughing. When vacation was over and we came home, things got even worse for me. My mother and father, at the insistence of Tracy and Helen, dug up all the old pictures of Harry and I on vacation when we were kids and showed them to the girls. I want to tell my girls one thing. Although Harry's birthmark was very prominent in many of the photos, I never heard any of my daughters mention or ask about it. I don't know if my sisters told them about it or not, but I never heard it mentioned. The next year we went to Weymouth again, but this time it was just me and my girls and Sarah and Marcy. Ralph was supposed to go with us, but he bowed out at the last minute, saying he had some business to attend to at work. I was surprised that Sarah took it so calmly, since he spends most of his time on the rigs. We managed to cram everyone into my car with luggage on the roof for the trip to Weymouth. For the first couple of days we settled in and had a great time. But Tuesday morning at breakfast, my girls suddenly announced that they wanted to go and find the tree with the carving on the trunk again. So around 10 o'clock, we hit the road. The 3 girls were full of energy that morning, singing and dancing for what seemed to me to be no reason at all. When we got to the tree, Tracy ran up to it and started yelling, "Yes, yes, he did it! He did it!" And the 3 girls then crowded around looking at the tree. As Sarah and I got closer, the girls moved away from the tree. Underneath the 1959 sign was another one. It said, H&H 1982. For a few moments I stared at it, not realizing what was going on. Then Ralph appeared from the nearby bushes. With him were a couple of kids I didn't recognize. She said you know where to find her. She said to tell you that she's where you spied the courting couples from. She'd like to meet you alone. I don't think I stopped to say anything to Ralph. I headed at a jog toward our old hideout. But when I got there, Harry was no longer in sight. Frustrated and confused, I turned around and started walking back. I hadn't gotten far before Harry suddenly popped out towards me. The old game we used to play when we were kids. Jesus, Harry, you scared the shit out of me, was all I could think of to say. Well, it makes a difference when you make me jump. We chatted with each other like we were kids. When we got back to the tree, the others had already left. Slowly, as we told Harry the story of our lives, well, the abridged version, we walked back to the caravan. Harry told me that when her father died, her mother was unable to maintain the caravan and sold it. According to her, she, like me, was upset that we never saw each other again. In time, her mother remarried to a very nice man who, when Harry was in her teens, paid a huge amount of money to have Harry's birthmark removed using a very early laser method. It hadn't been entirely successful, but it had boosted her self-esteem immensely. Then she said something that surprised me. She said that only one event had boosted her self-esteem so much, and that was when she met me as a child. She said that I was the only child she had ever met who had never once made a remark about a birthmark, or even asked about it. Harry then told me that she had married a soldier and bore him two wonderful children. But sadly, in 1978, he was killed during a drill. Since then, she had been living with her stepfather, and her mother had died of a stroke a few years earlier. That's where Ralph found her. Don't ask me how he did it. Sarah told me later that he got almost all the guys from his oil rig who lived near Bath to ask questions. Eventually, someone remembered a girl with a boy's name and a birthmark on her face. Ralph went there and found her a few weeks before the holiday, but I was kept in the dark until that morning. Sarah said she really thought Helen and Tracy had let the cat out of the bag a couple of times. Harry and her two children stayed with us in the caravan for the rest of the vacation. No, Harry and I didn't jump into bed with each other. We had a special friendship as children, and we recognize each other in adulthood. There's something to that, but we'll have to wait and see what happens next. Will there be a romance between us? I'm not sure, but I hope so, and I think my kids hope so too. I'll just say the signs are good. In Weymouth, everyone, including Harry's children, tried to stay away from us so that Harry and I could spend as much time together as possible. At the end of the vacation, Ralph and Sarah took Tracy and Helen back to their home, and I took Harry and her two children to Bath. Life goes on. April 2006. After a long drive along the M4 for the next 6 months, Harry and her two children, Russell and Claire, moved in with the girls and me. Shortly after moving in, we had a bit of an unpleasant episode when Helen and Tracy started calling Harry Mommy and decided that they would address their mother as Thelma. Harry and I tried to talk them out of it by not responding when Tracy and Helen called her mom. It didn't work because the girls had the connivance of Harry's children, Russell and Claire, who repeated everything Helen and Tracy said. When Harry answered them, she would also answer Helen or Tracy. I have to say it took a bit of getting used to, and Thelma was unimpressed to say the least. I don't know what happened between Thelma and the girls, but in the end she accepted things the way the girls wanted. Harry speculated that the girls threatened to cut themselves off from Thelma if she argued. Sometimes I was surprised by the girls' hostility toward Thelma, which seemed to grow stronger as they got older. And one day, Harry told me that my girls weren't stupid. As they got older, they realized what had almost happened to them and why the social workers and police officers were asking them all these questions that seemed so silly at the time. Of course, eventually Harry and I got married. No, we didn't rush into it. We had a very modest affair in Bermuda. Well, that was something quite different. We had local witnesses, and we didn't tell anyone about our plans. It's amazing how long Harry wore the extra ring before anyone noticed. Thelma's mental health had deteriorated over the years. It wasn't helped by the string of losers she'd gotten involved with. When Tracy married her half-brother Russell, Thelma was sane enough to attend the wedding and play the role of proud mother. She looked better than she had in years and was accompanied by a very proud father. Unfortunately, her father passed away a few months later, and shortly thereafter, Thelma was placed in a section that her brother had arranged. She now spends a lot of time in and out of the private clinic, which I might add costs my brother and I quite a bit of money. But I feel I have a duty of care to the mother of my children. Harry and I are very happy together. Now that all the children have grown up and moved away, we spend most of the year at our cottage near Weymouth. We enjoy walking the paths we used to walk on when we were children, sometimes with our grandchildren in our arms. Life goes on. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.